Welcome to Historic Seattle's 6th annual Heirloom Apple event and our first ever attempt at doing this virtually. So thanks for being here on this apple journey with us. Super excited to meet you all and talk all things apples for the next hour and a half. It's going to be fantastic. My name is Taylor Roden. I'm the Community Events Manager at Historic Seattle. I'll be your host, kind of guiding us through different segments that we have today, and probably not be one of your apple experts, but I will absolutely join you in like the tasting and the fun part of everything that we're doing today. Before we get started with the program, Historic Seattle knows that our properties and programs occupy unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples. This acknowledgement is not a substitute for developing relationships with Indigenous communities or for honoring Indigenous stories as we share our collective history. But this is a first step in recognizing the people whose land we occupy. As a preservation organization, we want to make sure that we are putting this message forward, and thank you for being on this journey with us while we continue to figure out how to best show up for our community. So back to our apples. So we're going to hear from a handful of apple experts today. So first up, we'll hear from Tara. And Tara has been popping in and out, reminding you all to share your apple varieties that you purchased in the chat. Please continue to do that. Tara purchased, was it 31 varieties?
I think I'm up to 33.
3 varieties.
And a couple more.
Today. And when we get to the apple tasting portion of the event, Tara will actually tell you about some of the things that you've purchased. So it's great that you're sharing so that she can prepare and be magical and tell you some fun facts about the varieties that you have today. But first, before we get to Tara and the apples, Tara is going to talk to us about the history of the Good Shepherd Center and the orchard there. After Tara, we're going to hear from Dr. Ginny Bolivar, who is at Washington State University in their Tree Fruit Extension program. Ginny is going to talk to us about how apple varieties are cultivated and produced in our state and give us some history there. I'm really excited about that part. Then we'll come back, and that's when we'll do our tasting. We'll do questions for Tara and Ginny. And for those of you who did bake something delicious, that will be the time where you can hold your good up to the camera and make all of us really, really jealous and hungry with your apple treat. And at the end, we'll have our team of cider experts, Paul Brookshire, Paul's here, I can see you, I'll scroll and find everyone else. Laura Cherry of Dragon's Head Cider and Marshall Petrini of Greenwood Cider facilitate our cider tasting and how to make cider, both how to make cider at home and kind of cider production on a larger scale. So we've got a full, awesome day ahead. And yeah, please use the chat. I love the chat and that we can continue to like talk and ask questions there. And I will do my best to field the chat and then share your questions with all of our cider experts throughout our time together. All right, so before we welcome to the stage, I just want to again remind everyone, use the chat to tell us the apple varieties that you've purchased. I need to figure out the apples that were purchased for me because admittedly I didn't have time to do that myself. So Tara, I may just hold mine up to the camera and we can play a guessing game because I have no idea what is there. And then Tara, that'll be fun for me. Tara also recommended that we all slice our apples before we get to the tasting, as exciting as it is to like bite into an apple. You'll probably have an easier time with the tasting if you go ahead and slice them. So Tara, it is time for you to take us away. Tara also is our lead gardener at the Good Shepherd Center and has been for a while now. Tara knows literally everything and is the reason that we have this beautiful, yes, Tara knows everything.
Setting the bar a little high.
Facts of life. Tara knows everything and is the reason that we have this amazing orchard still intact at the Good Shepherd Center. So, Tara, please take it away.
I wish that were true. I'm working on it. We'll see. I have a lifetime, hopefully. So thanks for coming together today to celebrate the Good Shepherd Center orchards. Our orchards were preserved by a community effort. So Historic Seattle has this tasting every fall to share with the community and celebrate this preservation success. So obviously she's already told you I'm going to share some of the information about the Good Shepherd orchards. I'm going to share my screen in order to show you a slideshow. Not exactly tech savvy, so bear with me. Things go wrong. Okay, here we go. So the grounds were saved in the 1970s. And this preservation effort saved a very tangible portion of our community history. Most of our trees are 85 to 112 years old. They're heirloom trees. It gives us a chance to experience fruit that we otherwise really wouldn't have a chance to experience. And that's valuable, but you can put as much value as you want on it. I think it's quite precious. Growing heirloom trees also gives us a bank of genetic diversity that will be available for future needs that we can't even anticipate at this time. So that's a value in preserving heirloom species. So while coronavirus keeps us from coming together in person and tasting all the varieties as usual, we can still take the opportunity to learn about the Good Shepherd Center apples specifically, but also put them in a broader perspective. Our apples are best appreciated with a bigger understanding of apple characteristics, uses, and history more broadly. So we'll talk about how we all got here. So the home of the Good Shepherd was built in 1907. The orchards were planted by the original portions of the orchard were planted by 1908. It was built by the Order of the Good Shepherd, an order of Catholic nuns, and as a home for girls. The home was built on 11.5 acres. It was largely used for food for the residents, and that was a lot of fruit trees. So this is the 1936 aerial photo of the site, and we count around 200 trees, give or take several. Is that a tree? Is that a fruit tree or not a fruit tree? But this is where we think it was really the height of the planting. And to orient you to this photo, if you're not used to looking at these, the biggest black blob is the main building. This is the south parking lot. This darker clump of trees here is now where the playground equipment is. And this is where the farmer's market sets up used to pre-COVID. So if that helps, some of these, so this is 1936, as I said, some of these trees have survived and are still productive. The site is now a City of Seattle Historic Landmark and is on the National Register of Historic Places. In addition to the old trees that have survived, we have also planted new trees in the last 40 years to replace those lost due to age or site developments. Most, with only 3 exceptions, our varieties are heirloom varieties. And for our purposes, that means they were introduced before 1945. There's also other dates used to establish heritage status, but the 1945 date, or basically pre-post World War II. Does that make sense? But other dates can be used. If you want more specifics about the details, our introduction dates, where the apples came from, usage, all that information is on in the pamphlet that was sent to you via email. And it's also, I believe the link for that pamphlet is it's also going to be in the chat window. So you can look at that for more specific variety information. We'll go over some of it, but I'm going to glance along so that we can actually taste everything else that we have today, along with some of these. So the orchard stewardship is shared between Historic Seattle and Seattle Parks and Rec and City Fruit. Our portion, the Historic Seattle portion, is what used to be this block in the southeast corner of the property. That's now the south parking lot. The trees along, all of these trees are gone, but the trees along the north and west sides, the ones that survive, are stewarded by, this is all Parks and Rec property. And those are largely taken care of by Barb, Burrill, and City Fruit. City Fruit is an organization whose mission is to make sure Seattle's urban landscape fruit is saved and not, or used and not wasted. So that's a great organization. Barb has been taking care of the parks portion of the orchard about the same amount of time I've been taking care of the Good Shepherd Center orchard. And we've had a lot of fun discovering what we have. We have no records, so it's been trying to figure it out. And we've done that with the help of Lori Brakken, our Apple ID expert, and she's on with us today too. So the part of the orchard that I can talk about is what I'm gonna have to call it the parking lot orchard, even though that doesn't sound too sexy. That's what it is at this point. There's the parking lot orchard. Oh, sorry, this is, I was gonna use this again, so I lost this is a picture from the park. So that's the portion that Barb takes care of. Okay, and this is from that southeast corner of the parking lot. This is 1919. You can tell by the relative age of the trees that by that time they're probably at least 10 years old. So that's partly that, and the 1908 photograph is how we date these trees. Let's see. So in the parking lot, okay, well, by the time the home closed, cars had already started parking in this area. And they were just parking among the fruit trees. When the parking lot was fully developed, obviously we lost some trees, but after which they replanted in the parking strips and in the perimeters. I'm really glad they did, even though, especially when I first started, and it's like fruit trees and parking lots are definitely incompatible, but it is a great nod to the historic use of this area. And it's one of the most prominent features of the site now. So it really makes it a great demonstration, and people can see that we have the fruit, we can talk about the history, and that's, in my opinion, a great opportunity. So now the parking lot has 15 to 18 varieties. And the range in that 15 to 18, as opposed to we have 17 varieties, reflects our uncertainty of some of the tree ID. So as I mentioned, we don't have records, so we've had to do some, well, when I say we, I really mean Lori Brakken has had to do some detective work to try to figure out what apples we have. And that's actually is pretty fascinating. As we figured out this history, it gives us a window into the history of the site. So for instance, you see four netted trees in this picture. That's all along the east side of this parking lot. Those are some of our oldest trees. Along these four and the one at the end of the building that we usually have the apple tasting under are all very similar, yet different. So we've spent some time scratching our head on that. And Lori, who's also researching other historic orchards in the region, is hypothesizing at this point that they're all seedlings of the same parent. And what that tells us is just seedlings would have been far more affordable to plant than a known cultivar grafted to a rootstock. So, and seedling does not mean self-sowed, it just means it's a seedling. It means that since it's not a grafted clone, you don't know for sure what you're getting. You're typically gonna know at least one of the parents, maybe, because they come up in orchards. So if you know you have a Golden Delicious orchard and you have a seedling, it's gonna be a Golden Delicious seedling. But you're not gonna exactly know what you're gonna get. And that's what we have. We have stuff. So I'll show you some of our apples. We've been calling this a Grand Alexander, and that's been confirmed. And yet we have doubts. We're thinking it might be a Wolf River, but a Wolf River itself is a seedling of the Grand Alexander. So this is, I'm gonna call it A1. This is, show you the whole plate. These are A1, A4, and A5. We've got two more trees. That produce a very similar looking apple, only probably twice the size. And I don't know if you can tell, but this is actually a pretty big apple. But they'll produce apples 2 to 3 times that size, just huge. But they still look very similar. Taste is very similar. So it's just been a little detective work. It's actually been a lot of fun figuring these out. This is probably for fresh eating, not one of our most popular apples. It's a little bit softer. It's tart, not super sweet. It's a great baker though. And that also reflects, today we breed for crunchy, juicy, fresh eating apples. But at the time, one, I've heard, whether it's true or not, I don't know, is that they preferred actually softer apples, maybe for dental care. I don't know. But this is soft. It's a great baker though. So that's just that tart apple. And when we get to the apple tasting part, I'll actually break down the apples by category a little bit and explain usage based on flavor, some of which I'm sure you already know. But anyway, that represents 5 of our apples. The other really popular ones in the Good Shepherd parking lot is King of Tompkins County. And people who have talked about this typically are familiar with it. They'll cite their grandmother's backyard. One of our previous artists in residence said this was the best apple dumpling apple she'd ever, that hands down, this was the apple you're supposed to use. And it routinely gets high ranks in our voting competition at the tasting. It's a very good apple. You can see it gets kind of yellowish. This one's pretty ripe. This one colored up very nicely. It's recommended that you bake with it when it's still a little green, but then as it matures and gets a little sweeter, it's yellow and actually gets a bit of an oily, waxy skin, which is a little off-putting to us actually, but it's a very good apple. Another super popular one is Melrose, same class. This was introduced in 1944, so barely make it in under that heirloom apple cutoff. Very similar in size to the King. Bright red, beautiful, beautiful, more symmetrical apple. Similar to the King, I think it also would make a great apple dumpling apple, or caramel apple for the whole darn family, because this is big. But it's got a great tart sweet balance, and that's also highly rated. The Melrose is newer. That was planted in 81, so shortly before the parking lot went in. The King is one of our old apples, along with what we think is an Olympia Baldwin. And so obviously it's a seedling of a Baldwin from Olympia, and it colors up better. This is underripe. This apple is still a good month and a half away from being ripe, but it would get a lot greener if I had left it on the tree. One of the types of apples that we have several that are Mac types. And I think most people are familiar with Macintosh apples, and some people are very familiar with some of these, especially the Macoun. People from New York tend to know the Macoun. It gives a very beautiful, rich brown color to the red. It's delicious. It has a spicy notes to it. All of them really have spicy notes. These make really great sauce apples. The mouthfeel is firm but a little soft. I mean, crisp but a little soft. I'm not a big fan of it, but man, they have very distinctive flavors, and they're excellent. So they make excellent sauce, and they're good to bake with. They're not going to stay as firm as say that King or that Melrose, but it's quite good. I cut this a little bit ago. Another one we have that it tends to get a lot of attention is this one called Liberty. It's also a Macintosh offspring, but it's got, I don't know how the color is. The color on my screen is not very good, but hopefully you can see. This is a super winey red skin. It's a smaller apple. Winey red skin that when you cut into it, this color in the flesh, the skin can actually bleed a little bit into the flesh. Not in a creepy way, in kind of a fascinating way. And that's actually, that sauce has a spice. It tastes like I put some spice in it. It's tart, but that's just got that beautiful white skin next to that wine red flesh, and it's just really fun. The other apple that I think is great and is in some circles considered one of the best apples ever. It's not as viable commercially because it doesn't crop as heavily as others, but this is a kid's red orange. It was developed in New Zealand. It is an heirloom apple, but it was in 1924, I think, developed in New England by the same breeder that produced the Gala. And this is an offspring of Cox's Orange Pippin, which I think some of us have today for the tasting. So that would be an interesting comparison. But the Cox's Orange Pippin is considered hands down one of the best English apples. And then the description I read classified this as an English apple too. So, and I don't actually know what that means. So if anybody does and can explain to me what it means to be an English style apple, that would be, I'm sure we'd all love to hear it. But the Kids is not a very pretty apple. Somebody just said that. Man, they're not pretty, but they sure taste good. But it's got russeting, and it's got this red with an orangey yellow undertone that's just really nice. But that's a super sweet, crisp apple. Reminds me a little bit of Honeycrisp, and the fact that it's juicy, it's crisp, a little coarse textured in the flesh. What was it? It was likened to a French champagne, or a French dessert wine, I think it said, because it just has a lot more nuances and characters. So it's just a really interesting apple. I'm not going to go through all of our apples. The last one I want to mention, because we have a couple others of the type on the park side. This is a russet apple, a russet style apple, and this one's Hudson's Golden Gem. And I don't know if you can tell, it's all brown and it's rough. It's not pretty by our standards. It's really good. Russets tend to be tart and nutty, firm. This one, when you cook it, it will not cook down. You would have to do a lot of mashing to try to actually make a sauce, but it would make a good chunks in a muffin. But I think it's really better fresh eating. This one is not really tart at all. Some of the russets have a tart character. This one's really just sweet and nutty. I think it's a fascinating apple, and it's one of my favorites, maybe just because it's so much more interesting than what we're used to. And we have other delicious apples, but I think those are the ones that stand out, and those are the ones that are kind of tend to be the favorites at our tasting. So now I think I'll turn it over to Barb to tell us about the park apples. How are we doing on time?
We're a little over.
Oh, already?
It just means that our tasting will be like a rapid fire tasting, that we will quickly eat those slices. That's okay.
Well, we can take people's temperature to see too if they're more interested in spending more time tasting ciders or apples. It's getting to be that hour.
Okay, I'm going to switch over to my Apple camera. Did you? Yeah, you introduced me. Okay, I'm good. Is that switching or no?
No.
Does that work? Exit full screen. Okay, well, I'll start talking about it while I'm trying to figure. Okay, I can figure out how to switch. Terrible. Oh, I know. Nope.
Nope.
That worked before. Oh, rats. That's terrible. I have such a nice camera set up here. So anybody else that knows Zoom, how I can do this? So I have, like Tara was saying, the Meridian apples. Okay, no, this is not gonna work. Okay, I'll just bring them up to the camera. So they're nearly all of them are heirloom apples. We only have one that is not.
Your main camera's off at the moment too.
Is it?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, maybe oh, okay, here we go.
Yep.
Gosh, what the heck? Okay, well, anyway. So the apples that, so most of the trees at Meridian Playground, we have 1 or 2 trees of each variety, except for the winter banana. And winter banana is a pretty strange name, but it is a apple from, I think it's from, Indiana. And when it's really, when it's really ripe and stored probably, then it's supposed to have aromas of bananas. But they are also the ones the bugs love the most, so we never store any, and I've never smelled banana. But this is what they look like. They get to be really big. 7 of these trees, they're too big to net most of the time, so we've netted some branches. But it's an excellent pollinator, and that's why people have winter bananas. I'm sure that's why they were planted, but let's see. They are good in cider, but I mean, the bugs are all over them. So The funny thing is we have another apple, which is, if you didn't have them side by side, or even if you have them side by side, they look almost identical. And these are as an yet undetermined variety. Lori's been working on this for a few years. She thinks it was a fall water now, but it looks a lot like a winter banana. It has these kind of ribs on them and is not as, you know, the bugs, anyway, when we net it, they look perfect like this. Okay, so I just think they're really beautiful apples. So these are all around the hedge and that area of the park, and then this is in the northwest corner, so it was planted probably later. So that's one of the undetermined, but old. They're both, you know, over 100 years old. So those have some similarities. Just want to show these because they are, you know, the old trees again. This is a delicious, not a red delicious, but a, like what I'd call a standard or a golden, or sorry, golden standard or a common delicious. Okay, they weren't very big this year, but we do have one tree at Meridian, a regular delicious. They're really good off the tree. Can't cook, don't store them. And then a golden delicious. This is not a very big one. This is a more typical size. Just picked today, same thing, eat them off the tree, very good. But these are good for cooking too. But Tara has one each of these to compare them to a purchased red and a purchased golden. Definitely eating apples, well, yeah, I guess I said, and good for cooking. Golden is. So I love these apples. So these two, okay, this is a Northern Spy. And my dad used to talk about these. He's from Minnesota, and these are they're good for northern climates. These are not quite ripe. They should be more red, but we picked them for this event. Very good for pies, you know, fresh eating. They're, yeah. What are they? I'm trying to remember where they came from. I think they're from Minnesota. Or they're from Rochester, New York. And then we also have, these are called Ontario, and these are the only apple from Meridian that has won the most popular apple at the earlier tastings. Was that 2 years ago? Its parent is a Northern Spy. You could definitely see the similarities there. And these are so good. These are good even when they're underripe. They're great fresh eating. They're great cooking. They're not ripe yet either. So they really need to be riper, to be redder. But there's one tree, it's one tree that's still netted at Meridian. So these are called greenings. These are what I call the American Granny Smiths. Granny Smiths, they're better, of course, better than Granny Smiths. But Granny Smiths are from Australia, warm weather, climate, super sharp taste. These are so American. This one is, yeah, this one's a Roxbury, or no, sorry, never mind. This is a Rhode Island greening, which is the state apple of Rhode Island. This is a Northwestern greening. I can barely tell the difference. It's supposed to be a greening for more northern climates, but we have 2 each. So we have 4 trees at Meridian with these, and just, you know, nice size apple, a little, not quite as grass green as a Granny Smith, but great for baking. I like to eat them. I like tart apples, but pretty, yeah, I mean, when they're protected against bugs, they're just nice big apples. So this is very sweet, and I mean in an affectionate way. This is an apple that Lori recently was able to identify because of a deep friend of hers in Canada knows this apple well because it's Belgian. And apparently there was a connection between the nuns at the Good Shepherd and the orders in Canada and France and Belgium. But this is called Renette Rouge de Toilette. which translates, and I had to ask my French friend, little red starry queen. So it's really little queen, little red queen with stars. But this is as big as they get. Okay, and they will all fall to the ground in the summer if they're not protected because the bugs love them. But they're lorineb? No, what am I trying to think? Anyway, yeah, they are used in holiday decor in France. That's kind of what they're known for, but they have a nice little raspberry flavor, super cute. We have one tree that's half gone. We're hoping it'll hang in there. The kids love to play on that one.
Thank you, Barb. Could we hold the rest of the apples for the tasting part so we can make sure to get Dr. Jenny's section covered before we move?
Yeah, those are all the old trees, so that's a good place to stop.
Okay, great. Thank you, Barb.
Mm-hmm.
Taylor, I think Tara was going to introduce Dr. Jenny.
I have it.
Oh, okay, great.
Yes. Thank you, Barb, and thank you, Tara. And we'll come back after we hear from Dr. Jenny. Definitely want to make sure that we hear about how all of these awesome varieties are cultivated and learn a bit more about the history of production in our state. So I'm going to read a quick bio, and then Dr. Jenny, you can come on the screen and take it away with your presentation. So everyone, Dr. Jenny Bolivar has a PhD in plant breeding and plant genetics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's a native of Columbia and has studied different plants since earning her bachelor's degree. After that degree, Jenny attained her PhD where she studied cranberries. When we met, she was like, I'm actually a cranberry specialist. And she's just getting to know apples and pear varieties. She joined Washington State University's Tree Fruit Extension Program, I think she said November of last year. And her mission is to transfer information and technology produced from the Tree Fruit Research Program to tree fruit growers and the industry overall. So Jenny, thank you so much for saying yes and for being here, and please take it away.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Taylor, for your kind words, and thank you for the invitation for this event. I am learning a lot from all of you guys. There's a lot of apple varieties that I didn't even know, so I'm really grateful that I'm here. And what I want to share with you, it is a little about the history of the apple cultivation. And I just put it basic, and hopefully I can go over it in the 15 minutes or 20 minutes. And from there, I will share with you my PowerPoint. I will go with the slideshow. Okay, do you see the presentation?
Yes, it looks great.
Okay, good. So I will keep it, I will try to keep it simple, not too redundant. So as Taylor mentioned, I am working at Washington State University, and I am a member of the Tree Fruit Extension team. And today, I will try to go through topics like what is the current production of the apples. I am focused basically in the apple production for fresh consumption. What is the origin of the apples, how the apples came to America, what is the history of the evolution of the cultivation of the apples in Washington. And I thought that it was interesting to bring an example of how a variety is produced nowadays. So we know that there's a lot of varieties that are being planted around Washington, but sometimes people don't know how long it takes to produce a variety. So I thought that it was really interesting to know how long it takes. And I will just put some key points or take-home points for ending my presentation. So the current apple production is led by China and United States. And within United States, Washington is the main producer of apples, getting about 60 or more % of the apple production per year. The remaining of the production, or the 38% of the production, is distributed in other states in the West area and in the East area of the nation. So why Washington is important, or how Washington became important in the apple production. So there's a lot of factors that make Washington an ideal place to grow healthy apple trees as well as producing high quality apples. The first thing is the soil. The soil is rich in nutrients and it is coming from the lava ash soil. We have a lot of sunshine. There's a high light intensity that will favor the color, the development of the color of the fruit and the sugars inside of the fruit. Also, the dry climate, it is really beneficial to the growth of the trees. Why? Because bugs don't like it. So there's a lot, like fewer pests that will attack the trees here in Washington. The other thing that is making Washington a strong apple producer is the adoption of technology for getting the production of the apples. The irrigation basically help the industry to use the water from the rivers to irrigate the apples, the orchards. So all of these things in conjunction make Washington a good place to grow apples. But where are the apples coming from? So the origin of the apples is in Asia, in the middle of Asia, in a country that is in the south of Russia that is called Kazakhstan. These, the apples here beginning to be improved like for thousands of years. And from there, they were just moved with the people that moved to Europe, to move to other areas of Asia. And this plant was fully domesticated as a crop like long time ago. We are talking about 4,000 years before Christ. So it is way long time that it was fully domesticated. And it was done this thanks to the invention of the grafting. How the apples came to the United States or to America, basically with immigration. So the people coming from England in the 1600s bring with them fruits, therefore the seeds, and also cuttings to plant apples. And they settled the first orchards in the area of Massachusetts, in Boston, in the 1625. These early orchards were mainly focused on producing the fruits for the hard cider, not for fresh consumption. However, we have in America a native apple, which is the crab apple. It is not as juicy as the other varieties, but it is important. It is still important in the industry of the apple because this kind of tree can be used as a pollinizer. So every time that you go to an orchard, you could see a crab apple in between of these varieties. Now, I researched about the history of the apple production. And since the people that were coming from England and beginning to get into the inner parts of the America, of the territory, so they brought with them the cuttings and beginning to establish orchards in the places that they were settling. And when they reached the area of Washington, the first orchard was established in 1826 in the area of Walla Walla. And from there were more orchards that were established in the Pacific Northwest. By the end of the 18th century, 1889, so the first commercial orchards were established. And by 1900s, the Whitman County in Washington was the leader in the apple production. And this was the railroads, the trains will help them to be the leaders because then now they can produce the fruit for their own consumption, and also they can transport the fruits for the other parts of Washington and also other states. The orchard growth, the orchard establishment continued to be expanded in Washington, and with the irrigation systems growing. So in 1910, other counties begin to be leaders in the apple production, like Chelan and Yakima, more coming. So you can see that it is coming from the west area of Washington to the central part of Washington. And as a curious note, and I think that it is really cool, that since 1920, Washington is the leader in the apple production in the United States and continues to be the leader. So I think that it is really cool. So more orchards begin to be expanded, more counties begin to be interested in the apple production. And it was increased to the south areas of Washington until we get all the orchards, or most of the apple production currently is focused on the counties that is in the central area of Washington. So with the evolution of the apple production, we have also the evolution of the orchards. For 1900s, the first commercial orchards were with big trees. As you can see in this picture depicting a normal tree that was in the orchards, you can see the other one here. So this was huge trees with huge trunks, big canopies, that they need a lot of space to grow. So how many trees per acre could grow with these huge trees? About 50 or 70 trees. And since they have like big canopies, the fruits were produced mainly in the outsides of the canopies, and then in the inside of the canopy, there was no light. So it was not possible to produce apples in that area. So these external production of fruits make it difficult to get a food production. Oh, I skipped one. And also the low labor efficiency for collecting them. The other thing is that these apples trees needed about 6 or 10 years for getting to the point to be fruitful, to produce the first crop. I borrowed some images just to show you how crazy the trees could grow by those times. And the growers or the workers had to be really creative with tools to be able to prune the trees, the huge trees, as you can see in this undated picture. They also had to get used to big ladders to get to these top canopies to grab the fruits. So the job was really not so efficient, and it was kind of a risky job. With the continued demanding of the fruit production, so the orchards have to be rethinking how they can be changed so they can produce more fruits for the increasing demand of fresh fruit. And it continued to be producing more different varieties, different rootstocks for getting smaller trees that they can harvest with higher fruit production until we get what typical orchard nowadays. And in this picture, you can see in the right side, this is a mature tree in an orchard. This is in an experimental orchard in the Irrigation and Agricultural Research Center in Prosser, where we have these small trees that they don't get, the tallest is about 7 feet tall. So it is kind of small compared to the big trees that we had early in the 1900s. Since they are small, so they can be easily controlled and they can be planted closer together. So we are seeing that these trees, a grower can plant easily 1,500 trees per acre, which could be impossible with these huge trees before. Also, they have been produced to get the first crop shortly, like in about 4 years after planting in the orchard. These trees are characterized also for high production and high efficiency in the labor. So this picture, so if you go to an orchard, nowadays you can see some ladders there, but the height is not so dangerous as previous. we still collect manually the apples. And we have some technology that is developing with the orchard. So in the same way that the orchards are being rethinking, also the technology is coming into place to help the grower to being successful with the fruit production. So now, I just wanted to bring this example of how a variety is produced. So nowadays, about I got this number, 7,500 varieties are produced in the world. And from there, like in Washington, about 8 are the leaders in the fresh fruit production. So we can see in the supermarket a lot of varieties, and we see these different curious names, but we don't know how a variety is produced. And I just wanted to bring this to you. And with this, Dr. Kate Evans from Washington State University, the Tree Fruit Research and Extension Center, shared with me some of the experiences that they have to go through to produce the variety that the university has produced that is called Cosmic Crisp, that probably you have seen in the supermarket right now. Everything started with just pollinating in 1997. So one plant with some characteristics with another plant was crossed. The seeds coming with these fruits were germinating, producing seedlings, and these seedlings from there on were beginning to be evaluated, and then the ones that didn't fulfill the vigor or the characteristics that they were looking for, they were discarded, and the ones that looked promising, so they were propagated. They were multiplied and continued to be evaluated in different phases for vigor, growth of the tree, and then at the end with the fruits. And it was, at the end, there's a huge evaluation of the tree and the fruits. And with the fruits, we also want to know, like, what is the number of fruits per tree, so could be commercialized, how they store, how they behave in the sorting in the packing line. And the other thing that is important is if the consumers like that variety, that fruit that they are producing from the years before. So, and after that, so there's the other type of study that is the marketing, producing the brand and everything that is beyond my knowledge at this moment. So with all of that, we can see that the first trees that were planted in the orchards were planted in 2017. Now, if I am taking you back, when I told you that the first pollination occurred in 1997, we are seeing here 20 years that has passed since the beginning, since the first cross that was done to produce this variety until the time that the first tree was planted in a commercial orchard. And from getting the fruit, we had to wait 3 or 4 more years. So when you go and see a fruit like a Cosmic in this case in the supermarket, this is the first crop that they have. So you are thinking, or now you can think that it has passed 24 years of evaluation and science to get into this variety. So I just think that it was really important just to learn about this, how the varieties are formed for fresh production. And with this, I want to conclude, like, just to summarize. So apples are not from USA. The only apple is the crab apples, and it still is important. The apples are coming from Asia, from a country that is called Kazakhstan, brought to America in the 1600s, and cultivated as a crop in the 1800s. Washington has been leader in the apple production since 1920. And it takes about 20 years to produce a variety since the first crossing to the first plant in the orchard, plus 3 or 4 years for getting the first crop, the first apples. So with this, I'm sharing with you some of the references that I use for getting this history, like brief summary of the history with in this presentation. And I would be happy to take any question or comments about the history of the apple. Thank you so much. And I will stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Jenny, for sharing that. That was really interesting, and it's a perfect time for us to, like she said, take questions. And actually, if you have questions for Jenny, Barb, or Tara, that would be a great time to just unmute yourself. Is that what we decided? I just said it, so I guess that's true. Unmute yourself and go ahead and ask the question. And then Tara, I'll turn it over to you for how we're going to do our rapid fire tasting before we hop into our cider portion. So yes, first questions, yes. Oh, Jen, you're getting so much love in the chat. There's a question. There's a question from Sarah. She says she's interested in planting apple trees in her Seattle backyard. Where is the best place to ask questions for how to do that? That might be a Tara Barb question.
Barb, you're muted. Lori might be a good one to ask too, if she could pipe in. Unfortunately, I don't actually know much about buying them. I inherited a ton to take care of, so.
Oh yeah, I mean, City Fruit has some recommended varieties, the Seattle Tree Fruit Society, although they're kind of geeky about it. I would buy from a local nursery, not a big box store. And they have, I think February, they come out, start selling the largest variety. And that's a good time to plant too.
I will say a couple of the organizations do grafting sessions. So if you have any fruit, neighbor's fruit, our fruit that you would be interested in growing, you could actually ask us and get some scion wood. I recommend the kids orange red. And you could get some scion wood and take it to a grafting workshop. And that would be a lot of fun, a fun way to start your own fruit trees. But obviously the local nurseries often have a lot of good stuff too. And they have a lot of aspires, which are especially great for, one, they're just great, they're productive, they're small, and they're great for our small backyards. Lori Brakken knows a ton about aspires. She has 400 something in her backyard.
Thank you. Okay, so we have apple tasting to get to. So thank you all for your participation and for dropping the many varieties that you picked up in our chat. There are so many, Tara. I don't know if you've been reading the chat, and I can read a few off to you, but I will turn it over to you to kind of guide us through what is what.
Okay. So great selection of apples. We want to do this rapid fire, so I guess I want to hear from you a little bit more about what you're interested in the short version. I had hoped to do a kind of a categorization of apples, and maybe I'll blast through that really quick, because if nothing else, it's also a good lead into cider. Flavor-wise, apples are grouped into sweet, sharp, sharp-sweet, bitter-sweet, and bitter-sharp. I know that sounds like a lot, and there's 3 factors that determine that. So a sweet is high in sugar, low in acid, low in tannins, and we'll let the cider people explain tannins to us, because that really comes in for cider fruit, and I'm curious about it. The sharps are essentially tart apples. Granny Smith is your classic. Sweet are the ones that we most likely are going to be eating for fresh. Golden Delicious, Honey Crisp. Granny Smith is your classic sharp. Sweet sharp is that has high sugar, high tart, and high acid, sorry, and low tannins. Some of our newer cultivars, I would say a Cosmic Crisp probably falls in that category, because it's acidic, so it's tart, and it's also sweet. That tends to be my favorite eating apples as well. And then you get into bittersweet, so high sugar, low acid, high tannins, and bitter sharp, which is low sugar, high acid, high tannins. And those two categories, bittersweet and bitter sharp, are what is used for especially European style ciders. And I think Barb has a cider apple with her, but otherwise I've still never tasted a cider apple. I understand you bite into it, it dries your mouth out. that would be a bitter sharp, I understand. So I want to hear from the cider people what those taste like. But so that's a rundown. Some people have some really interesting apples, certainly ones I haven't seen and I don't have. So I'd love you guys to actually take the stage and tell me what you want to taste, or if you have an apple you're especially interested in, tell us about it.
And there was a great question in the chat about where to find some of the more unusual apples. Thank you, Shirley, for that question. So Tara, you have over 30, and then like you said, there are some varieties that it sounds like you don't have. So yes.
Sorry.
No.
Yeah, I have that question too. So people, when you tell us, especially if you have a less usual apple, tell us where you got it. Like, where did the Summerfield come from? And the PCC, I think, had the Ribstrom Pippin.
Mhm.
But like, so I went to PCC, Metropolitan Market. Both of those, in my experience, have had a lot of Metropolitan Market's doing a lot of heirloom apples. But they have some new PCC. Apparently it depends on the store you're at. At the Ballard one, they had a lot of newer introductions. So I have several of those, and the PCC in Fremont sounded like it had a lot more heirlooms. But even, where else did I go? I think I saw a Jonna Gold. I think it was QFC, and Ballard Market didn't really have that much. So those are the only ones I can speak to. But I would say your specialty groceries are probably going to be the ones. I know there's farm stores out and about up in the more rural areas of Valley too, that I think carry more select varieties, and the farmers markets, of course. I know there was one grower at the Ballard Market, which I think is operating now with COVID. That grower grew in the Methow, and they had a bunch that I had never heard of. So, and hopefully, if nothing else, you come out of this really inspired to try every new apple you see, and compare them, because we think we know what we like, and of course we do, but we might like it a little better, even maybe a little less when compared with the full range of things. So, what would people like to try? Please don't be afraid to speak up. Unmute yourself. All right. So who had I think Amy had the summer feld? Amy?
Yes.
Any chance you would like to taste that and tell us about it?
That's the very mild tropical.
If you're not ready, I did kind of put you on the spot. Sorry about that.
Which is
This is like very mild tropical on this episode.
okay.
Very mild.
I'll turn my camera back on. Okay.
Hi, Amy. Sorry to put you on the spot there.
Oh, that's okay. Can everybody hear me? Is it good? Good. Okay. This one is the Summerfeld. I got it at PCC in Bothell. And it's very mild and sweet and kind of tastes like tropical fruit. So.
There's apparently a Fuji Gala cross.
Yeah, and Garrett says it's a Fuji Gala cross.
Okay. Let's see. So, anybody else? I know so a couple people had the Orleans Renee. Somebody can tell me how to pronounce that properly. And that's one of the ones that I've been tasting. It's small. I've seen it a couple years now at Metropolitan Market. And it's going to be a good baker. It's tart. I'm trying to find mine. Small little apple. I've already cut half of it off. Let's see, tart and flavorful. Anybody? I think that's really good. I thought that was really promising. But anybody else?
We're interested in getting an apple ID that we just picked yesterday. Ben's grabbing them.
Thank you for bringing that up. I had meant to say earlier that I hope I'm not chewing in your all's ears. Lori Brakken, who does our fruit ID, is very generous with her time, so she has welcomed us to not us, but you guys to talk, contact her, and her email will be posted in the chat. And she will tell you how to send her apples so that she can ID them. No personal contact at the moment, but you can send her apples and she'll work on them for you.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah. Can you show it to us?
Don't wash them.
Yeah. She'll outline that. Yeah, don't wash them. Can you show it to us? Ah. What's it taste like?
So far, we like it better than the Jazz or the Ambrosia Gold that we bought at the store. And this was just from our neighbor on Finney Ridge.
Is it sweet?
It's sweet, but it's also tart.
Nice. It looks like it has color development good enough to probably be ripe. Yeah.
They were falling all over the ground. This one was one that fell on the ground. But they're in pretty good shape.
Okay. Nice.
Mm.
Can let's see.
Hey Tara, can I ask a question?
Please.
I have an opal
Oh,
that I got at QFC in Ballard, which kind of surprised me because it looked kind of unique, and QFC usually it's not my favorite store for produce. It's really good. It's a really good apple, but the skin is very thick, so it's kind of chewy. It's kind of chewy, but I have that, and I have the Tango and whatever else I said I had. Another one. And the other two are really bland and uninteresting, and the opal is really sweet with a little bit of tang to it and super crisp and delicious.
does anybody else have anything to say about the opal? It's my favorite new discovery, and it's not. I've known about it for a couple years now, but I have 32 apples in front of me that I've just tasted, and to me, it's a knockout. I mean, I won't call it my favorite, but it almost is. It's tart, it's sweet, it's firm, like you said. It's like, so when you want to make a pie, the common wisdom is to use a blend of apples, some sweet, some tart, a lot of tart. You want firmness. That opal to me is like all those apples in one. And that and the Honeycrisp had the flavors that really just packed a really noticeable punch, and had that crispy, juicy texture that we want for fresh eating. To me, I really prefer the opal. I think Barb preferred a Golden Delicious. Of my Golden Delicious, now it might be very based on.
What? No. Compared to what?
What were you comparing the opal to that you said you liked better?
I don't know. I just didn't like it. I don't like yellow apples.
Well, I agree with that. It's not pretty.
I don't like
it. It doesn't taste like any other yellow apple I've ever had. It tastes
that's good.
Yeah,
it doesn't taste anything like a Golden Delicious. But no. I would say try making I made a pie with it a couple years ago after I'd done a bunch of the Good Shepherd apples. But when I make Good Shepherd pies, I'm making single variety pies, specifically because I'm trying to test out this fruit. And that's what this seemed like, a blend of apples all in one piece of fruit. Absolutely delicious. Wow. But for those of us interested in baking, matter of fact, did we have anybody that wanted to show baked goods?
That's actually a perfect transition, Tara, because I was just going to say, I want to make sure that if you bake something, we have an opportunity to celebrate you and your baking, because that is science that I personally am not very successful at. So please show us your stuff. And if you did not bake something, would love to have you get up and grab your cider, because as soon as we see these wonderful baked creations, we're actually going to introduce our cider folks. So, perfect.
Hi, Shirley here. I love to do the baking and taste all the baking every year. And last year, I made I made something called a Dutch apple bread, which is more like, it's sort of like a coffee cake. See if I can hold it up to show you. And last year, well, it doesn't look like much from here, but it's, last year I used apples from the orchard that Tara gave me, and it turned out perfectly. And I don't remember the apples. I think one was a Melrose. I used a blend of apples that she gave me. This year I used Granny Smith, and it did not turn out nearly as well. If anyone wants the recipe, I think I sent it to Tara last year, and I'll send it again if you'd like it. It's really a great recipe, but I don't recommend using Granny Smith. Maybe the opals or some other apple would be better. I did try the Sweet Tango, and on the outside, it looks like a beautiful apple. It's a big apple. I was very disappointed at how bland the flavor was. Most of the new apples to me have a very bland flavor. So I'll definitely try the opal. But I was also going to say that the Orleans Renette, I'm wondering if it has an ancestor in the small apple that Barb was describing as the little nun's apple, because I think that was a Wren something, and it's also small. So maybe there's some connection there. Thanks.
I haven't actually researched the apple to know the parentage, but I'll look it up. So that's one thing I would like to leave us on a note, since this tasting was, not much of a tasting, but you all have apples, so taste them. Obviously, you can see from the list how many things you can try. It really is interesting to go through them side by side. You learn a lot more about the apple than just thinking, I love Honeycrisp, that's great. They all taste great when we taste them all by themselves. When we taste them together, you really learn a lot more. Something else I love to do, especially if you're a baker or if you like sauce or cooking anyway, is to have just put a couple slices in the microwave for 20 to 30 seconds. Especially some of those newer varieties that are bland, or some of the old varieties like Golden Delicious, Gala, which my Gala is like, why would anybody eat this? But still, some of these blander varieties that don't seem like much, or if you want to see what a blend is like, put those slices in the microwave for 20 to 30 seconds and see how that flavor changes when it's cooked. It's a really simple way to do it, and it is actually quite remarkable. It's surprising on some of them, not all of them, how much a flavor actually does come out. The Macintosh is an apple that is very popular, very tart, very distinctive flavor. To me, I don't like the mouthfeel of it. It's a little too soft. But man, when you cook that thing, it's obviously a great candidate for baking. The flavor really just comes out. So try that if you do at-home tastings. And then also, hopefully, y'all look forward to coming back to the Good Shepherd Center and trying our apples next year.
Thank you, Tara. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Barb. And thank you to our bakers. If we didn't get a chance to see your beautiful creation, will you please send a message to Historic Seattle in the chat? Because we still want to know what you made. And yeah, we want to reward your time and your creativity. So now we're going to move into our cider segment. So if you haven't already, please go and grab the ciders. I want to thank Preston Press. Thank you, Chris, for partnering with us and curating these really awesome cider packages for our event. So we have 3 cider experts who we're going to hear from today. We have Paul Brookshire, who's a longtime home cider maker and a cider enthusiast. Marshall Petrini of Greenwood Cider, and we have one of Greenwood Ciders in our pack. It doesn't matter which pack you got, it's in there. And then Laura Cherry of Dragon's Head Cider. And again, we have a Dragon's Head Cider also in our cider kit. So we're gonna start off with Paul, and then Marshall, and then Laura. They'll guide us through cider history, production, and of course, our tasting. So, Paul?
Yeah, all right. Can everyone hear me? I guess we have to go through this little technical check beforehand.
We can hear you.
Okay, excellent. Awesome. Well, thank you for having me. Thank you, Tara, for suggesting that I provide a little bit of information about cider, hard cider. The there's several people on this call, or on this event, who are just or if not more qualified than I am to discuss anything about cider. So, but hopefully don't want to present myself as any sort of exclusive cider expert, but I have been doing it for a while. I've been making hard cider for 8, 9, 10 years, kind of slowly got into it. And in a similar way to a lot of people in Washington State, that you have friends with extra apples. You have a friend whose grandparents have an orchard. You know, there's usually some sort of connection to a surplus of fruit, and which is really just a starting point, because then you got to make juice out of it, which is quite a challenge usually. So I started off that way. Several friends in Yakima and in the Methow Valley had old orchards, started making juice, just sweet juice. And they said, hey, you know, we hear about this hard cider thing. And this was really before 10 years ago, hard cider in this country really wasn't a thing. And I'd sort of heard about it a little bit from various other sources, mostly from England, gave it a try, sort of got hooked for various reasons. But from then on, just progressed, really found it fascinating how it connects essentially horticulture, botany, sort of the natural world. You can sort of get involved with it through the mechanisms, the process, and you could eventually create a really beautiful product. And you can make something that's really presentable at home to give to your friends and family. That is, quite a special thing, especially if you've told them the story that you actually picked these apples, or even better yet, planted the tree. When you're making wine, when you're making beer, usually you're not out there harvesting the grain. So it's like a whole soup to nuts sort of experience sometimes. But I guess one thing is really interesting to define is what is cider. And I think it's most important to note that cider is a wine made from apples. It's really simple. You take a juice with sugar in it, yeast ferments it. The yeast either turns the sugars into carbon dioxide or alcohol. And in the process of making cider, you let the yeast work through all the sugar. The carbon dioxide goes out the top of the vessel, the alcohol stays in, and then it essentially we're eliminating all of the sugar out of the juice. So that's basically what it is. And so it's made very similar to a wine, more like a white wine than a red wine, for various reasons we might have time to get into. But that's essentially where the science of cider making ends, and the art comes after that, where you're talking about blending, you're talking about working with the finished product, using the certain kinds of apples, blending those together to get your the desired result. It was mentioned, Tara early mentioned the 4 types of apples that cider makers consider are sweet, sharp, bittersweet, and bitter sharp. Something of a misnomer, I would say, that the bitterness, the tannins are desired, they're sought after, but they're not required at all. You can make a sharp cider that's very aromatic, that is really more like a white wine or a champagne, and it doesn't have those sort of bitter tannic qualities that some of the English or French ciders do. So there's actually a wide range of cider types that you can make, and there's a wide range of cider types that you can purchase, both from the European areas and also in the United States. So I guess one of the things that Tara said is that I would say that the sugar levels, you always want them as high as possible, because essentially as the yeast takes the sugar and divides it more or less in half by weight or volume. So if you have, say, an apple that has 15% sugar, it'll produce more or less a cider for 7.5, for example. And that's pretty typical. Most juices range from about, I'd say 12 to 15% sugar. So you can kind of cut that in half, very roughly speaking, and get the alcohol. As you note, that cider is about 6.5 to 7.5, maybe 8% alcohol, which is half that of wine. So if you've ever realized that actually means that grape juice is twice as sweet as apple juice is. But those 4 types, you have the sweet apples, which are sugar, and low in acid. So then you have the sharp, which are probably similar levels of sugar, if not a bit more, and high in acid. And then you have the bitter sweets and bitter sharps. The bitter really reflects the tannin qualities of it. And the sweet, of course, goes back to the low acid, the sharp, the high acid. To make a good cider, you really want a balance of all of those. Typically, you can read the books and it says, you know, maybe 15, 20% of each type of bitters, and then maybe 30 to 40 to 50% if you want a low tannin cider with the other types. And it's really just, that's where the art comes in. And you can make various types of cider. You can make a sharp cider, which is the one I'll be tasting. Then you can make a bittersweet or bitter sharp. And they have very distinctive qualities, very distinctive aromas, very distinctive pairing opportunities, really. So I think, but what is tannin? And tannin, the scientists on the call might be able to be a better explanation. But one of the ways of thinking about tannin in the perception of it is it's the bittering qualities. It's what dries out the mouth. And what in red wine, for example, you know, sort of bites your palate right here. And it's like, what is good about that? And I guess you could say in one respect, it produces a little bit of mouthfeel. It produces a little bit of longevity. It's not just sort of a really quick sip and it's gone kind of experience. Interestingly though, like why is it in cider fruit? Why do we want it? And I think that gets a little bit into the history of cider, where traditionally, you know, there's a good explanation of the history of the apple, I guess. If you read the cider literature, that cider probably was a dominant use of cultivated apples in France, in Spain, and in England, primarily in the apple growing regions of Europe. Probably cider making, cooking, drying is probably pretty critical. Probably not a lot of hand fruit. You know, I think that was probably not a major use of that type of apples. So one of the stories that cider makers like to tell is that each farm, this is kind of the wisdom that we receive from England, each farm had their orchard, had their cider orchard. And typically they paid a good bit of the wages of the farm workers in cider. That was late, it was like outlawed actually in the late 1800s for obvious reasons. But each farm and essentially competed for labor with the quality of their cider. And over time, I believe that tannin, as you know, like you tan leather, the tannin in oak, it's actually a preservative. So it actually has a tendency to preserve the cider. You didn't have pasteurization, the people didn't understand how cider was sort of preserved over time. And the tannic ciders tended to be longer lasting. So my personal kind of belief is that it just sort of evolved that way through the selection of the drinker, through the selection of the production, that people tended to prefer and select ciders made with tannic apples, and then therefore they just sort of became more propagated. But I think in the current cider making traditions, tannin does have a tendency to improve the longevity of the cider. We have other modern methods, of course, of pasteurization and storage in cool environments and such. But that's where it comes from. One critical thing, though, I think with making cider is that you don't really need that tannin. You can sort of approach a cider that's sharp and aromatic without the use of tannins. And that's important for the home cider maker because 15, 20 years ago, there probably was not a tannic cider apple grown in any quantities whatsoever. I think Laura might be able to, from Dragon's Head, might be able to speak a little bit to how long cider, real true cider fruit has been produced in this country or in this region even. And it hasn't been very long because we as a country lost the cider making traditions in the 20th century. What's said is in the original discussion of the history of this, of apples in this country, most of the early apples that were brought into this country were for cider making. I always like to say that Johnny Appleseed was a real person, and he was probably planting cider apples. He wasn't planting, golden deliciouses out there in front of the pioneers, because just like in England, cider was actually a really critical portion of the farm economies. And here they also did pay farm workers in cider. So they had the similar dynamic of local production. And through the early 1800s, as the story is, there was more Germanic immigration, and as we opened up the Midwest, grain production increased, and that grain production was cheaper, it was easier to store, and through the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s, beer production essentially took over, in a lot of respects, cider production as the dominant fermented beverage that was consumed in this country. So that was sort of the beginning, I think, of the reduction of cider as it was important to our culture. And we've forgotten about it, I would say. We don't think about our history in terms of how cider, or the apple production, was, really, it was pretty much an everyday thing. They said that Thomas Jefferson drank a tankard a day. There's quite a few stories of, the people in the colonial times where cider was an everyday drink. So we're getting that back now. I think it's part of the interest in sort of in local cuisine, sort of the diversity, as we've heard today, just the diversity of apples is astonishing. And cider really sort of gives you a window into that, because we haven't even talked about the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cider varieties that are in use today in this discussion. So let's, and from a home cider maker perspective, it's
Sorry to interrupt. I know we were running late, but I did just want to make sure that we invited Marshall and Laura up too. So, hello, Laura. And I think Marshall will hop on just a second. And I definitely want you to get into the cider making and this tasting, but did just want to make sure that we were saving time to also taste all of this delicious cider that we had. And I would be happy to share information with our folks via email, because I know you have a lot of info, which is awesome. And I know you have like even YouTube videos that we can share with folks about cider making. So Marshall and Laura, I did want to just give you all the floor to talk about your companies and what we are going to sip today. And then Paul, I would love to have you also talk us through the Chatter Creek selection.
Sure. Do we want to start with, I think we discussed earlier, starting with the Chatter Creek. Yep. Because it's sort of the whoa.
Chatter Creek, then Greenwood, then Dragon's Head.
Yeah.
Yes.
So Chatter Creek was, this cider was part of the 6-pack from Preston Press. Was I was mentioning before that actually this is a cider that is made from heirloom sharp apples. So it is a cider made with 2 American heirloom apples, one of which is the Golden Russet, which I have here, and one is the Newtown Pippin. So it's a blend of those 2. So if you have that one, what you're going to experience with this is kind of more of a champagne quality. It's a cider that is not tannic, and you can tell that in 2 ways. One is that tannic ciders tend to be darker in color. So I think when you are first approaching a cider, you want to look at its color. The lighter, the less tannin, the darker, the more tannin. And its aroma. Sometimes the tannins have a bit more, what we call phenolics, a bit more leathery, peppery, more kind of feral, I would say. I like to say feral, just because it's a bit wilder, a bit more farmhouse. So Chatter Creek, Newtown Pippin, Golden Russet, and these are apples that are commonly available. So this is a cider that a home cider maker could make. You can purchase this kind of juice, and it's nice and sharp, and it's really good to pair with I think hot food, creamy food. Its acidic qualities pertain to that. So cheers. Not a lot of mouthfeel. Not like it doesn't sort of grip on your tongue or your palate, but it does fill it with a nice sort of sweet appley essence, as it were. So it's a nice one. Anybody else have any experience of this one out there? No?
No questions yet, but if you do, just share those in the chat since we all can see that. And Marshall, go for it.
Hi, my name is Marshall Petrini. I am one of the founders at Greenwood Cider, located here in North Seattle. We started over in Greenwood, had to move down to South Lake Union, then moved up to Maple Leaf. So we've been all around the city. As anyone knows, real estate ain't cheap. So we have a small space, no tasting room, been around for 4 years, growing slowly, growing organically. Like Paul said, we kind of started, we had friends who had too much fruit and just started pressing it, making cider on the cheap, and it just got out of hand. So yeah, here we are now, like a full-fledged business. So today, whoever's trying it, we're tasting the whiskey barrel Heirloom. And this is a blend of over 13 varieties, bitter sharps, bitter sweets, mostly Fox Whelps, Muscadet de Dieppe, and Reine des Palmes. I don't speak French, so I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce it. But that's the main varieties. Those are mostly bitter sweets, so it's gonna have that mouth feel, the kind of grab you by the tongue, shake it around sort of feel. Turned out a little bit boozy, as you can tell, 9%. This was a blend that was just not quite as aromatic as we wanted it to be, so we threw it in some whiskey barrels from Westland. They're kind enough to do this cask exchange program with a few places, and we take their barrels, we give them back, and we see what happens. I don't know if they're ever going to do anything with them, but we did something with theirs. So that's what this is. As you can tell, or can't tell, kind of a mahogany color. That's the tannins that Paul was talking about. The whiskey and the wood are going to feature very prominently. Spent 6 months in the barrel, so that'll happen. And then it's kind of got kind of a musky, minerally mouthfeel to it, very dry, not really champagne-y, very light carbonation. And if anybody has any notes on how it tastes and want to share, there's no wrong answers. You know, feel free to kick it around, and it's always interesting to hear how people describe different things and how it hits people's mouths differently.
Marshall, this reminds me of a funky orange wine. I'm loving it. It's really unique.
Fantastic. Yeah, we anything can happen when you throw it in the barrels. It's kind of like you don't know what you're getting from them necessarily, and we don't necessarily we taste it every month or so and just make sure it's progressing nicely, and then we do some blending at the end and see how it matches up, and something that's palatable and something that's a little different. We always try to be a little bit different. It's kind of always been our approach. So
if anyone else is tasting and wants to speak up, please just unmute yourself.
Or if anyone has any questions about this cider, about Greenwood, or cider making in general. Let's see, I got so carbonation for the home cider maker. Yeah, I can talk a little bit about this. Maybe Paul can shed some more light, because we've kind of graduated to the professional level, I suppose. But there's a couple ways you can do it. One is bottle conditioning. That is where there's like a fermentation that happens in the bottle, and that'll produce the CO2. Unless you got your levels down, you know what your sugars are, you know what kind of yeast is still in there, that can produce some wild results. So be careful with that. Read up on it before you try it at home, because you can have some bottles blow up. We carbonate, where we actually have a stone, and they call it a stone. It's like a metal rod that is got a tiny microscopic holes in it, and that pushes CO2 into the cider, kind of recirculates through there, and that carbonates it faster than your typical bottle condition thing, which is might be a couple weeks. So we can, that's the way we do it. You kind of control the levels a little bit better to cater to the desired, style that you're going for.
I would add to that, Jim, the process of making in-bottle fermentation, as you mentioned, was, it's essentially making champagne. And yes, be careful a little bit. Kind of some numbers. If you take a still cider that's completely fermented out, no sugar left, and you want to bottle it with carbonation, a good way of approaching it is to take what's like 5 to 8 grams per liter of sugar. Cider makers use a lot of metric, which is helpful, which actually isn't very much. You'd have to weigh that out if you wanted just to use maybe like less than a teaspoon, half a teaspoon per bottle. And I like to put a little bit of yeast in there because sometimes you don't get enough yeast to reactivate. So a little bit of yeast, a little bit of sugar in that bottle, cap it. Don't use corks because they leak. And yeah, it's easiest to just put it up on its bottom like this, let it sit perhaps a bit warmer if you're doing this like in April or May or June, maybe just sort of, keep it in the kitchen. And, 2, 3, 4 weeks, you'll probably start to get some carbonation. The lees, what's called the lees, which is dead yeast, will fall to the bottom. The longer you sort of let it sit, the more compact they'll be and it won't get cloudy. So it's a really nice way of doing it. I think one of the critical factors in is that all of the cider then will be dry. I don't know what the Greenwood is for residual sugars, but this Chatter Creek is actually about 20 grams per liter residual sugar, which is kind of medium dry, medium sweet. So it's going to go completely dry in the bottle. So one way of fixing that is just to take a little bit of sugar at the table and squirt it in there. You don't have to drink dry cider all the time. You can make sugar afterwards. So does that answer your questions about how to do that?
Thanks, y'all. And I just want to make sure that we have Laura talk, and then Chris, I saw you unmute, and I think we can go until 5:15. I think that's what Naomi told me. So definitely want to give Laura the opportunity to talk about Dragon's Head, and then Chris, whatever you were going to say, I'm sure it was brilliant and something that we all need to hear. Chris is the owner of Preston Press, and they are the company who created all of this and made sure that we all got our drinks today. So Laura, and then we'll do a final Q&A, and then we'll go about our Thursdays and enjoy this cider.
Great, thank you guys. I'm Laura Cherry, and I'm the owner of Dragon's Head Cider. My husband and I moved to Vashon Island in 2010 to start the cidery. And so we bought a piece of property here that had space for an orchard, planted about 400 trees that first winter, started purchasing cider making equipment that we would need. And today we have an orchard of about 8 acres, and it's around 3,000 trees, 75 different varieties in our orchard. And all the fruit that we're growing is almost entirely cider specific fruit. So mostly bittersweets and bitter sharps when we were talking about those apple categories earlier. We do have some sharps and sweets, and we have a handful of heirloom varieties, but the vast majority are more traditional cider apples. And that's what's in the cider that we shared for this program with you. It's what we call our heritage cider. It actually says on the label estate bittersweet apples as well. And I'm going to open mine and pour a glass while we keep talking a little bit. So we're a small family-owned cidery. We've got a crew of 7 people total, and we produce about 40,000 liters of cider each year at this point, really only selling in Washington State and a little bit down in Oregon, and shipping a tiny bit direct to consumer across the country, but pretty local. Our community on Vashon Island is also pretty supportive, and a lot of our cider just stays right here on the island. We have a tiny little tasting room that's open on weekends, all outdoors these days with lots of COVID precautions, of course, but And this cider, I would say, is kind of like our flagship because it's all fruit from our orchard. It's one that I think really lets the cider-specific varieties that we grow shine through in the cider. So when I'm tasting it, you know, I'm noticing first the appearance, which is a really nice golden color. The cider is also clear. We don't filter at all. Our process is pretty slow. We make cider once a year during harvest, so we're pressing all of our fruit right now. All those fermentations run slowly over winter. We'll start doing blending trials in the spring, and really we won't bottle anything to sell until May or June of next year. When I smell this cider, I'm smelling butterscotch and spice and a little bit of hay, really nice, rich aromas. And then on the flavor, again, it's classic cider apple blend flavors. You know, the bittersweets really provide some nice tannins and structure to the cider. You get a little bit of those caramel notes, a little bit of citrus zest in there. I don't know if anybody has anything else they want to share if they're tasting the cider, but.
Yes, feel free to unmute and share either what you're tasting or ask questions. Now that everyone's had a chance to at least talk about the ciders, we can talk about any of the things that we've heard from.
Or
I'd be happy to answer questions.
Do you in-bottle carbonate any of those?
So the vast majority of our production is done force carbonated in a bright tank, similar to what Marshall described. We do a small amount of our production method champenoise or method traditional, which would be the secondary involved fermentation, which is it creates a very different bubble structure. Really a little bit more refined and elegant, I would say, but it's pretty labor intensive unless you have fancy, sophisticated equipment.
That's one of the fun things from a home cider making perspective, is that actually it's the easiest way to do it. And since you don't have the you have time on your side, you can just let the bottles sit and you can make some really nice in-bottle fermentations with a really nice mousse, very tiny bubbles. It's very impressive if you want to impress your friends with it. So again, but it goes out completely dry. So nice. It's a nice home cider maker's touch.
Kai, I see your statement in the chat there. I would love to talk about the Mukai project for a minute. So the land where our orchard is and our cider making facility is on a property that was a strawberry farm around the turn of the century. Just to the north of us, there are a couple parcels of land that are now owned by and managed by a nonprofit named the Friends of Mukai. The properties were owned by the Mukai family. They were a Japanese family that farmed strawberries here on the island. Our land was their strawberry fields. And over the last, since we moved here, or a little bit after that, the Friends of Mukai have been doing a beautiful job of restoring the old farmhouse and Japanese garden that surrounds it. And they've just begun a restoration project of the fruit barreling plant, which is a large building right next to the house where the Mukais used to pack and ship their strawberries from in barrels. And so we have been in conversation with the Friends of Mukai for a number of years now, and we're now on a path to eventually becoming the tenant of their building once they finish renovations of the barreling plant. So returning a pretty amazing historic property back into fruit processing, this time of apples instead of strawberries, but apples that were grown where the strawberry fields used to be. So it feels like a really special partnership that we're very excited to be a part of, and and a pretty amazing historic preservation project as well.
And
I'd love to answer Shirley's question because I think it relates really well to the conversation earlier on all the apple varieties that you were tasting and talking about. For Wes and I, I think we both in our young adult life traveled to Europe and tasted cider when we were there and realized that it was a beverage that we really enjoyed. But it was much later than that, you know, probably 14 or 15 years ago, when we both happened to read Michael Pollan's book, The Botany of Desire. And if you haven't read it, I kept thinking about the book during the conversation earlier, because there's a chapter on the apple in that book that really tells some neat history and fascinating facts about apples. And it's what really inspired us to start looking for unique apple varieties in grocery stores and farmers markets. And then we started experimenting with those apples and pressing the juice and, you know, fermenting it into cider and in carboys in our kitchen kind of thing, all home cider making. But it grew from there, for sure. It started with a fascination with the apple itself.
Awesome. Thank you all. So we're at our time, and I know we have lots more questions. I have questions, but we are over, and I want to be respectful of everyone's evening. So I want to say thank you, Paul, Laura, and Marshall, so much for saying yes and for talking us through your cider varieties. This was really awesome. I know that, oh, Chris is still here. Thank you, Chris. I know that you're driving and on mute, but we really couldn't have done this without you. So thank you. Dr. Jenny, really, really appreciate you for being with us and for your very thorough and wonderful explanation about apple varieties and cultivation in the state of Washington. And of course, thank you, Barb and Tara, for curating us through apple varieties and talking about the Good Shepherd Center and really tying our whole event together. So I have a lot. I saved the chat to hopefully address your questions in an email. I'll send some follow-up materials to everyone because I've gotten a couple of questions about that. So you will be hearing from us. And again, thank you for being here. Enjoy your cider, enjoy your apples. And sounds like we need a part 2 because we just didn't have enough time. So look out for something. Maybe that can happen. I don't know. I'm over promising right now, but this was really fun. And have a great rest of your evening.